Good evening, everyone. I'm Ian Roxanne. I'm a professor here in the law department. Welcome to our event with Professor Miranda Stewart, who's visiting the department on Still Unequal, Gender, Tax and Welfare in Australia and the UK. So we have, besides Miranda Stewart, Tasneem Kadiri from L'Oreal, where she's UK and Ireland Tax Director, and Fran Bennett from University of Oxford and the UK Women's Budget Group. So Miranda is a professor and director at Melbourne University Law School and a fellow at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Australian National University, where she was inaugural director. So she teaches on a wide range of tax law and policy issues, including gender impacts, but also international issues, development issues, and domestic issues, and is a frequent media and public commentator on these. Fran Bennett is a senior research and teaching fellow at the University of Oxford on issues of social security policy, gender issues and poverty, and is also an independent consultant working with groups like the Child Poverty Action Group, Oxfam, and of course the Policy Advisory Group for the Women's Budget Group, analysing UK budgets and tax policy. Tasneem Kadiri is UK and Ireland Tax Director at L'Oreal, responsible for direct and indirect taxes, with 20 years' experience in tax and audit consultancy in both practice and industry. She sits on the Institute for Chartered Accountants, Large Business and International Tax Committee, on the Committee for Women in Tax, and leads the AMA Best Practice Group, the Multicultural Professional Network Forum in the Heart of Law. So Miranda is speaking for us on Still Unequal, Gender, Tax and Welfare in Australia, and our other two panellists will add a UK perspective. Tasneem will give us a broader gender inequality perspective, and then Fran will bring the focus back onto the UK tax and transfer issues to provide a counterpoint to the Australian perspectives from Miranda. Can I remind you to put your phones on silent? We are recording the event this evening, and so if everything works correctly, it should be up on the Department of Law website later this evening. So, would you please join me in welcoming Miranda?
Thank you. Probably wander around a bit. Get to see a clock.
If you want to wander, we can give you the roving mic.
I think I can. Do you think I need a... I sound pretty mic'd up. I can hear it anyway. I don't know if you can. So I think there's a mic working here. So if I just wander in this zone, maybe I'll be right. So thanks very much, Ian. It's really wonderful. I'm visiting at the LSE Law School for 3 weeks as a visiting scholar, and it's lovely to be here. It's really great to meet Fran and Tasneem as well, and thank you for the effort of sort of responding to this, and thanks everyone for coming. So once you start talking about tax and gender, although it might seem that there's not too many connections, actually there are many, and it can be quite hard to work out where to stop, because it's a bit like talking about tax. Those of us who do tax policy and theory analysis, tax is really the whole world, and so you can start talking about everything together. So I sort of want to tell you a narrative that's focused mostly on issues of the relationship between tax and work and care. So it's a segment, but both the kind of immediate effects of that on women's workforce participation and the intersecting effect of policy. So tax policies and family payment policies and childcare subsidies and unequal workplaces, wage gaps and gender segregated workforces. And when you put all these things together, you get these intersecting unequal outcomes. But then I want to say a little bit about the kind of life course effects of that, the longer term effects for retirement savings. And then if I have time at the end, we'll keep track of time, so we have time for commentary and questions. There actually is, in the end, a connection to international tax, surprisingly, at the end, particularly the way that women and tax planning operate at the top of the So obviously Australia is not the UK, but it's an example of a sort of a rich country with highly developed tax and welfare system and a very strong reliance on the personal income tax. So that personal income tax is really dominant. It's pretty dominant here in the UK. It's more dominant in Australia in terms of revenue raising. And we have a broad and well-established but tightly means-tested or targeted welfare system. So it's that combination we're going to look at. So I'm going to briefly start with the idea of what do I mean by gender equality, what sort of goals, what can be our benchmark for this analysis, say something about the income tax and the role of the tax unit, who is taxed in the income tax, the individual or married spouses, then look at the concept of what we call effective marginal tax rates. Don't know how many people have heard of this idea. I'm sure my colleagues have. So you might know what a marginal tax rate is. So we'll talk about this sort of substantive or effective marginal tax rate that is produced by intersecting policies. A little bit about, as I said, retirement incomes of women at the top, and then a couple of conclusions. So there's lots of ways to think about gender equality, and one could have an entire course or class or series of talks about that idea. Most tax laws and many or almost all welfare laws these days are gender neutral on their face. You know, they apply to men and women equally. There's no specific treatment. Actually, we might hear some countries actually do have some special rules, even in their tax law, for women or men. But certainly in Australia, these laws are all formally gender neutral. But really, I'm more interested in understanding what is the substantive effect, economic effect of these rules, because of course these formally neutral rules operate on substantively unequal work and family arrangements across the population. So the concepts of substantive equality and capabilities I find most useful. This is a definition and quote about substantive equality from UN Women. This idea of addressing direct and indirect discrimination, and in particular, this is a pretty revolutionary statement by UN Women, that once you start to consider these sorts of substantive disadvantage, you actually are looking to transform the institutions and structures. That includes workplaces, family arrangements, as well as laws. So the capabilities approach, some people might have heard of capabilities. Amartya Sen's concept that comes out of the development literature, combining human rights with economic analysis, is quite a useful way to think about tax policy, I think, not just in developing countries. It has some key features which I think are useful for thinking about gender. It requires you to focus on the individual, like human rights do, that each individual has, rights and so on that should be respected. You need to look over the life course. What are the effects on people's capabilities to live a good life over their life course, not just at any one point in time? Obviously, material well-being, actually having access to goods and so on. And in particular, Martha Nussbaum, as a feminist philosopher, extended this idea by focusing on the cost of care. This was something that Sen has not ever really explicitly addressed, but they have done quite a lot of work together. And Nussbaum has this really wonderful quote: "A good society must arrange to provide care for those in a condition of dependency without exploiting women, as they have traditionally been exploited, and thus depriving women of the other important capabilities." This huge problem will rightly shape the way states think about all the other capabilities. Now, the reality is that states don't think about that, but no doubt care is a huge issue at the centre of these analyses. Okay, so a gender impact analysis of taxes and transfers. We want to look at women's paid work and unpaid work inside the household, effects on individuals, effects between households, effects on money and time over the life course. And we want to look at actual outcomes and also behavioural responses. How do people behave behave or respond to tax rules. So as I said, Australia's tax transfer rules are facially neutral on the whole. Income tax law, definitely. Cash transfers. We're going to focus specifically on childcare subsidies and family payments to families with children in this talk. Something else that's important is actually the mode of delivery of things like childcare. So Australia, most countries are hybrids of some public and some market and some family provision of these sorts of goods. Australia has, in particular in childcare, a strongly marketised system where people are fee-based, in fact, systems for profit. And that does have an effect. So actually, this is a newspaper story from just about a week ago in Australia. And this is exactly the issue that I'm going to show you some analysis about. So Sydney mother Laura Papiani sends her daughter Juliet to Mrs. Hutchinson's childcare centre in Ryde, that's a suburb of Sydney. I'm sure this is a for-profit centre probably, where fees are $119 a day. So that's long day care. We pay for long day care, 10 hours a day, because you have to buy a day of care even if you don't use it all. That's about $11.90 an hour. That's not atypical in terms of the cost. She would like her 4-year-old to have 3 days of daycare a week, so she is able to work more in her firm, but the cost of care means she's only able to afford 2 days. We love her centre, but I had to reduce her care. So this is even with the childcare subsidy that I'll explain, that the cost of care is prohibitive. And it's her decision not to work, rather than it would seem perhaps her husband's or partner's decision that is the decision that is affected. The other thing about this childcare package, which was recently expanded, that's why it's newsworthy. So we spent more money on it from July 2018, and this news story is saying people still can't afford care. Childcare package all but gone 18 months later. Because our childcare sector is largely provided in the market, fee-based centres, fees have gone up. And so the government's subsidy has been absorbed in higher costs, and hence the benefit has been lost. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of evidence about labour supply in Australia and the market, and then this sort of interactive effect of tax and childcare subsidies. So since the 1970s, many of you are not old enough to remember the 1970s. I moved to Hong Kong in 1976 from Australia, where I grew up mostly in Hong Kong. Obviously, women's labour force participation has increased, right? Men is the black line. In fact, it has slightly decreased. I'll go into why that is. Women, of course, have increased their participation in paid work in Australia. They have not closed the gap, though. We still have a gap, even after so many decades. But if you look a little closer, this is the same chart, but just broken down into full-time and part-time employment from the 70s up to today. And essentially, full-time employment has not changed across the population. Full-time employment of women, all the increase is in part-time work. So women are participating more in the labour market, but they're doing part-time work on a kind of statistical basis. So why is that? We're in a kind of equilibrium where that is not being changed. And I think it's actually pretty clear, one reason is pretty clear why, and that is the tax transfer interaction that I'll show you. We have a big gender wage gap in Australia. I know you have wage gap analysis here in the UK as well. The hourly wage gap is around about 13%, but the earnings gap, and these are full-time workers, the earnings gap is about 30%, the average earnings gap. And that means that total earnings, and that's because of our sex-segregated labour market. So women predominate in areas of the labour market that are lower paid social services care. And this is a typical pattern internationally, but it's quite an extreme segregation in Australia. So obviously that already is a disincentive for women to work, right? You're already just not even leaving aside taxes and things, you're just going to earn less. So if you have a choice inside your family to stay home and care for kids or something, that choice becomes already more attractive. And the other thing is that it makes women the secondary earner in the household. Statistically, commonly the secondary earner with a lower wage. Not always, obviously, but often. That just shows the sex segregation of the labour market by industry, so I won't go into that. The blue is where men predominate, and the orange is where women predominate in different industries across the sector. So a couple of other charts. So the standard economist model of how people work these days is that, you go to school and then university and then you increase your work. This is this blue line on the left here. There we go, that works. And then, you work hard and your hours stay high for sort of 20 or 30 or 40 years, and then you gradually taper off and retire. So that's a male working pattern. Women obviously don't do that. So women are the red line here. They work less overall, except at the beginning. And obviously they duck down in those middle years. And of course, they work part-time much more than men. If we break it down by age and children, we can see that participation gap, parents aged 20 to 74 with children under 5, nearly 40% of women are not working if they are in that family situation. This is just participation. What's interesting is that even when the children, this is the young age of the youngest child, is 6, so the children are school age. So then now they're back at school, right? And we tend to think women go back to work. Well, obviously many women do go back to work, but there is still a substantial participation gap. So what happens is there are these critical points in women's working lives where once you leave the labour market, you stay on a path. It's a path-dependent process that affects the whole life course of women's earnings and career trajectory. A couple of other things. Women do more unpaid work. You have a time use survey here. We also have one, it increases dramatically over that age, 20 to 40. And this is the big one in terms of that aggregate statistic. It's women who work part-time, not men. So in total, obviously some men do work part-time. But when we look at parents with the child under the age of 5, 8% of men are working part-time, but more than 60% of women are working part-time in that situation. That's the equilibrium I mentioned. Why is it so strong, that equilibrium in Australia? So we need to have a think about how these tax rate policies and transfers work together to see that. So first of all, if we just think about the income tax, so you'll be familiar with a progressive income tax system with an increasing marginal rate and a tax-free threshold. That's what our system has in Australia. Because your average tax rate is the total tax paid as a share of income. And then we can talk about these effective marginal and effective average rates, which are produced by the combination of the tax rate structure and means testing or withdrawal of benefits. So if we say you means test a benefit, then as you earn more income, you lose that benefit. You lose some of the benefit. Okay, you move over a threshold. It might be phased out at a rate of 50%. So for every dollar you earn, you lose 50 cents of your benefit. It's like a tax. It operates like a tax. So you have less disposable income. Okay, so these are our marginal tax rates in Australia. We go from 0 up to 45 is our basic rate structure. It's already a bit weird and lumpy because we have some tax credits and offsets in the rate structure. So actually our rate structure goes up and down in reality. It creates its own peculiarities. And that's what the basic structure looks like, right? That should be familiar, that idea of that increasing marginal rate. Okay, so let's just think about individual and joint units. So that rate applies to individuals. We've always had an individual unit in Australia, actually from the first federal income tax. So we have a long history of taxing the individual. In fact, what happens though is we take the family into account in the welfare system as a joint unit. So it's often said, well, what's what would be more fair? What if you have a dual owner family or a family with two spouses working and kids and a breadwinner homemaker model, you know, as an alternative? In our income tax, because we tax individuals, actually the dual income family pays less income tax. Because each individual goes to work, earns income, has a tax-free threshold, the lower marginal rates. So for example, if you had a breadwinner homemaker with a breadwinner earning $100,000, that's more or less the tax they would pay, an average tax of 25%, the marginal rate they face is 37% rate. You have two individuals each earning $50,000, so the household has $100,000 of income. They pay much less tax, right? They're earning much less income overall. So, is that fair? Which family is better off? So, of course, it's not enough just to look at the tax people pay, even though that looks kind of like the main thing we should be thinking about. So that individual progressive tax rate actually supports women going to work, but it's not enough, because if these two families have children, we have to work out what happens with the care of these children. And of course, the breadwinner homemaker family has free and untaxed care services provided within the family. The dual income family has to access care services and pay for them, unless they have grandma, right? So people do use informal care, and that's how they avoid these costs. If they do have to pay, that payment is not tax deductible, right? So you pay out of after-tax income. So it would not be unrealistic for a dual income family with a couple of kids to be paying $40,000 a year in childcare costs, and often people will pay more than that. So what that does is that pushes up the effective cost of working of that dual income family. Their disposable income is so much lower after the cost of care. Now they face rates of 55% to do the sums. So if you kind of go back and you say, well, which family is better off? You have to look at that deduction of $40,000 of cost for that dual income family. Okay, so that's assuming there's no subsidy for childcare. So you can imagine if someone else is paying for that care, then we're in a different situation. So what we need to think about now also is what is the labour supply response to having higher costs. And what we're assuming is that at some point that effective tax rate will be too high and will be a disincentive to the work, especially of the second earner. And we need to look at both the tax system and social security benefit level, the level of subsidy a family gets, whether it's taxable or not, whether it's means tested, what the phase-out rate is. It's quite complicated. It's sort of mechanical but complicated, right? The effective marginal tax rate. And every country that has a progressive income tax and means tested benefits faces this issue, has the same problem. Okay, so Australia's childcare subsidy, there is quite a big subsidy, but it's tested on couple income, right? The income of the family, not the income of the individual worker. The income tax applies on the individual, but we means test the subsidy on the family income. And we also limit it and cap it in all sorts of ways. So you only get 85% of the fee, and then you face a cap per child of about $10,000 maximum. So there's a lot of limits on this subsidy, designed to keep it as cheap as possible. What's the effect of that? So here's a peculiar looking chart. What this chart does is it tries to look at what the effective marginal tax rate is for the second earner in the household going to work as a result of combining taxes, losing family payments, and losing childcare subsidy as they start earning income. So it's what we call a cameo chart or cameo modelling. It's not a real family, it's a hypothetical family. So what we have here is a family with an average income, and we're assuming they pay about $11.77 an hour, which is sort of some sort of standard childcare rate. They buy long day care, 10 hours a day, so they have that cost. The primary earner is already at work, and they're earning the average wage, right? So the average wage in Australia, full-time earnings, is about $87,000 a year. So our primary earner is already working. Usually, that's the male partner in the household. So what we're looking at here is the second earner making a decision to go to work or not. When she goes to work, the family gets more income, more earnings. That means they will have less family payments, supports for their children, and they will lose some of their childcare subsidy because they have a net that now they have to pay childcare. They use the subsidy, but the subsidy doesn't fully cover the cost. Okay? So what we did is we modelled what would happen if you went to work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, because that's a realistic decision in the Australian labour market. Your women might decide, am I going to work 3 days? Can I work 4 days, right, in terms of labour decisions? So if she goes to work 1 day a week and she's aiming to earn $70,000 a year, which is female average weekly earnings, lower, right, than the male average full-time wage, so that's that gender wage gap. So if it was 1 day a week, she'd earn about $14,000, right? The effective tax rate on her of going to work 1 day a week is about 50%. She's not paying any income tax, so the red here reflects the income tax. But if she's only going 1 day a week, the tax-free threshold is nearly $20,000. So she doesn't actually pay any income tax at all. She still faces an effective tax rate of close to 50% because the family loses, yellow and blue are these family benefits paid per child, like a welfare benefit. The family loses an entitlement to those benefits because now they have more income. These are means-tested benefits. And there is a net childcare cost that is not covered by the subsidy. So when you put those things together, let's say she earns $100, and she gets to keep $50 of it, right? Effective tax rate of 50%. So the family's still better off, but not that much better off. Okay, if she goes to work 2 days a week, so this is cumulative, the effective tax rate on her second day of work is at 70%. Now she starts to pay a little income tax. That's indicated by the red here. The family loses more family benefits, child benefits, and the net childcare cost, net of the subsidy, is higher. So she has an effective tax rate of 70% on day 2. They're still better off than they were before. They're better off with her going to work. Day 3, the effective tax rate we calculate is about 65%. Now she doesn't lose any benefits anymore. They've lost them. They're not eligible for the child benefits anymore because they're over the threshold. They have net childcare cost and income tax, basically. Day 4, her effective tax rate is more than 80%. And day 5, it's about 90%. So, if this was you making this decision, family needs a bit more income, I want to stay connected to the labour force, it's good to be working, it's good for the kids to be in childcare, right? You're making this decision as a family. Sure, I'll go back 1 or 2 days a week, we're a bit better off, that's all good, maybe 3 days a week. Would you go back 4 days a week, or would you go from part-time to full-time work? Much less attractive, right? You might do it if you're thinking about the long-term benefit of doing that work. Your future income, future retirement income, you can afford it as a family. This is that situation where I'm not going to take that extra day. I can't afford it. So this is just one cameo in the slides, which can be accessed later. I have some other examples, but it happens in every family situation, basically. Okay, so women and families making decisions about women's work are perfectly rational, right? They are responding to an economic incentive, usually. So these are some of our other examples that different. This is a lower income family, and the effective tax rates they face on days 3 to 5 of work are even higher, close to 100%. You could go to work and get nothing for it net because of losing the benefits and because of the cost of care. The way you might solve this problem is you get grandma to look after the kids 1 day a week. You laugh, but it's true. So about 30% of Australian families use some form of informal care. That means mostly grandparents. This is why. I mean, of course, they like to have family care as well, but there is a really strong demand for that care in order to enable you to go to work. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to go more quickly through a few other things, and I can come back to explain these things if there are questions later. So just a couple of things about long-term consequences, and then we can continue. So one consequence of this, of course, is that women are not engaged in the labour market as much as men. Anyway, their wages are lower. So we have a private retirement savings system called superannuation, very, very substantial. There is a gap in superannuation contributions. It's about 17% on average. It's a much bigger gap for some families. And many women don't have superannuation at all because they're not connected to the labour market at all. So there's no contributions for them. That gap is a consequence of women staying in part-time work, losing that connection to the labour market. That has these ongoing consequences, which I won't worry about. But you can see this if you look at the age of men and women from 20 to 24, men already have more super contributions than women, but it's pretty equal. It's pretty close. By the time we look at age 40 to 44, men have sort of a third again of the level. This is an average contribution for that age group. The average savings from contributions by their employers. The 2/3. By the time they get to age 70 to 75, men have twice the amount of retirement savings than women. It's mostly because of the labour market, these labour force issues. Okay, so that's one effect. One other effect that I think is interesting to sort of wrap up this discussion is about the individual tax unit again. So I'll take us back into that and then we can stop. So we did a bit of a look at women who are in like the top 10% and the top 1% of the income distribution, which you can do by looking at the tax data. And, you know, so as in other countries, in Australia, the top 1% has about 8 to 10% of the income. And so it's interesting to think how many women are in the top 1%. The way most people get into the top 1% is by working and earning high wages. It's actually high wages that pushes most people into that top. It's the top 0.001 who are earning capital income. So women in the top 1% are about 20%. So for a start, very big gender gap there. So women are about 25% of the top 10%, 20% of the top 1%, and 17% of the top 0.1% in Australia. It's interesting to compare with the UK and other countries, so we did a comparison of that. So in the UK, and what we find is a bit odd. So Australian women are 25% of the top 10%. It's higher in Denmark and the UK. So there are actually more women with high wages, right? Higher is my guess, right? In those countries. So Australia is behind, even though we are a rich country with, you know, a lot of professional women and so on, but they're not earning the levels of income. Maybe because they're working part-time. If you look at the top 1% though, it's reversed. Australia has more women in the top 1% than the UK or Denmark. And in the top 0.1%, it's even more reversed. So Australia has 17% of women of the top 0.1% of women. In the UK, it's only 10%. Denmark is 10%. The data's a bit out of date. So it's peculiar, isn't it? Why do we have not as many as in the UK, but more in the higher, smaller fractions? Well, there is an explanation, and the explanation is tax planning, using the individual unit to income split with a spouse. So it's a big part of the explanation. I am coming to an end, Ian. He hasn't waved a flag at me yet. I know time is running. But I want to show you this because it's a consequence of the individual tax unit, but it's a way of reinserting the family unit, the joint unit, into the system again through tax planning this time, rather than through the transfer system. So if you imagine a high income family with a single earner, breadwinner homemaker family, right? Where let's say a partner in a law firm, wealthy law firm, or so Mr. Everett and Sarah, those who are Australians would know that there is a case called the Everett case in Australia, which is about income splitting by professional partners. So if Mr. Everett earns $700,000 and Mrs. Everett earns $0, under our current tax structure, if they split it equally, or if he can get 49% into her hands, the income taxed in her hands, remember they will pay less tax because they both get the tax-free threshold and so on. So you save about $25,000 a year, $26,000 a year of tax doing that. This is very common at the top of Australia's distribution. And it's common with wages by partners in law firms and accounting firms because they make use of a particular tax planning structure. And it's also common for investment income using trusts in Australia, which you can't do as much in the UK, I think. So again, we're unusual here. So what we see is that women are reporting more income in the tax return, which is the data I use. But it's a result of income splitting. It's not necessarily a result of earning that income themselves. And just to show you how alive and well this is a news story from February the 11th, and this is the connection with international tax, so I'll finish up on this point. The reason why there is so much focus suddenly, there is a parliamentary inquiry at the moment into the level of tax that the large accounting firms are paying, the big advisory firms, KPMG, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, right? The firms, of course, are partnerships, right? They're not corporations, so they've got caught up in the BEPS, this multinational avoidance sort of drama. So now there is this interrogation into the tax planning that the partners are using to reduce their tax burden, and that's this tax planning structure that I mentioned. So what they're calling this high-risk income splitting model, they've structured their affairs in accordance with this suddenly there is a scrutiny of that, which there wasn't in the past. So who knows, we might actually see some law change as a result of that. So suddenly we're looking at this. Okay, so, but what has happened is that it's the breadwinner homemaker structure that makes this tax planning work. It wouldn't work if the spouse was earning income because you wouldn't get that advantage, tax-free threshold and the lower rates. There'd be no point in splitting income if you're both paying tax already. It only works because you reinsert this dependent family relationship. Okay, so my conclusion, you need to look at individuals. You need to look at the combination of these policies with the labour market, with the tax planning, with the family. It's pretty obvious to me that actually we respond quite rationally to these incentives, but in the short-term way. We often don't think of the longer term. It creates these long-term patterns. And high-income families take advantage of these structures to have these effects. Okay, I'll stop my presentation there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm sorry I went a little over there, but let me get out of here now. Yeah. You want to stay down there? I can bring.
Yeah, I'd like to hear. Thank you. So thank you, Miranda. That was really interesting. And Ian, thank you so much. And Fran, it's great to speak alongside all three of you. So Really great opportunity, and it's great to speak to you all. So, is it this one?
Yes.
Just make sure I press the right one. So I'll start off, I'm going to zoom out and give a bit of a wider perspective on gender inequality in the UK. So start off with the evolution of women's equality in the UK, and I want you to talk a bit about how the equality legislation and law has changed over the last over 100 years. But what's really interesting is 1918 is when women first got the right to vote in the UK. We're now over 100 years past that date, but we're still in this room here in 2020 talking about gender equality. I don't think anyone would have thought all those years ago that this would still be a topic, but it clearly is. Then in 1968, some people will remember or may have read about the famous Ford factory site where women went on strike at the Ford Dagenham factory, and these were female sewing machinists, and they decided to go on strike because their roles were seen as unskilled versus their male counterparts' roles were seen as skilled, and there was a 15% gap in their pay. That was a really incremental point in British history for gender equality. Oh, I'm not quite sure what I've pressed there, sorry.
Press one of those other buttons again, you might have accidentally.
Yeah. Sorry.
And it might be one of the buttons on here that you showed me not to touch.
Sorry. Apologies.
No. It might be on it might have been the remote, Ian.
I've clearly pressed something on there, haven't I?
Ian, are you sure it's not one of the buttons on the
No, I'm not sure. But
device? There you
Aha.
go.
Right. I will make sure I just stick to the one that changes the slide now.
They're very
Apologies.
dangerous, these things.
They are.
I like that 15% gender wage gap is
Yeah, it was
consistent, isn't
really
it? It's still the same.
quite interesting. Well, actually, what was really interesting, as part of that strike, they managed to negotiate an 8% increase in pay rise there. And that was a really incremental point in British history when it comes to women's equality, because that resulted in the 1970s Equal Pay Act. Then in 1975, we had the Sex Discrimination Act that came in place. And until 1975, women were not able to open up a bank account in the UK. So that was really interesting. They were refused mortgages without having a male guarantor there. And until 1982, women were not allowed to be served in pubs as well in the UK. So that's quite interesting. Lots of interesting facts. I know, it's really extraordinary. Then in 1986, we had the statutory maternity pay that was introduced. 2010 even, we had the Equalities Act. 2014 is when shared parental leave was introduced, and I'll talk a bit more about that later as one of the things that I think can make a change to gender equality in the UK. And at the same time, Clare's Law was also introduced, which helped protect women against domestic violence, which I will also touch on later as well. But I think, just to round up the history point, I think it's shocking that we're still talking about women's equality in 2020. And actually what's really worrying is Davos predicted, not this year, but last year, that it would be another 200 years before we got true gender equality. So I think we all have a part to play, and I think we need to make sure that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So moving on, just focusing a little bit on what's causing these gender inequality effects, so in the wider society and the government policy. So clearly there's a need for reform of childcare, and specifically, even though in the UK there are tax incentives for childcare and there's tax credits, 3 to 4 year olds in the UK, depending on the earning capacity of the parents, do get 30 hours free childcare. But I think what really needs to change is the wraparound care, and also what happens to children once they start school, so age 4 onwards. There's a real society impact in terms of, like, typically impacts women more in terms of school pickups, school drop-offs, etc. Paying for nannies is quite expensive still, so what support can be given there? There's also the social care impact as well, where commonly it's the woman in the household who will look after elderly relatives who are ill. More needs to be done to recognise the job of carers. perhaps there needs to be some further allowances that need to be paid towards carers. It's a huge task. And then there needs to be more funding of public services. So I think gender inequality is not just about getting more women at UK board level. Obviously, that does need to be tackled. But in addition to that, we need to think about providing basic conditions for women to thrive and to live as well, to have equality there. One of the biggest things that I'm actually quite passionate about, I feel we really need to level the playing field for men and women. So by that, what I mean is we still don't have enough share of household responsibility. So when it comes to caring for children, the burden commonly falls on women. Equally, housework, and I've already mentioned the caring for elderly relatives. So that's quite interesting, as I think until it becomes equal for men, and I'll touch on it a bit more later, but I think men also need to feel comfortable about feeling that they can leave the workplace earlier. Still in this day and age, it's more common for women to request it and they feel more comfortable, but men still find it quite awkward to say, I need to go and pick up my kids from work. And until we get to a point where there's equality there, we won't really move on this topic, I feel. Then, of course, there's a structural challenge, which Miranda, you talked about, which we also have in the UK. When you end up with dual earner households in the UK, there's the higher tax impact that impacts family decisions, and also the cost of childcare. So a lot of households take the decision for women to drop out of the workforce because it just becomes too expensive, or the extra income she's bringing in by the time the childcare cost is taken into account and the tax rate, it almost doesn't make it worthwhile. So it's very much an economic decision. Then one of the most recent reports that has just been released is the Fawcett Society report, and that talks about, in some ways, it makes for quite depressing read, but also there is some positivity in the report as well. So it talks about the fact that men still dominate every sector, including politics, public life, and business. And it talks about the fact that we're still decades away to get true gender parity. So a bit more optimistic than Davos, which is good and reassuring. And then what's also interesting, it talks about the picture is even worse when you look at women of colour who are simply missing altogether at some of the highest levels in certain sectors. What is promising about this report is it talks about the fact that this 2019 general election in the UK showed that for the first time we had a majority of female MPs in the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties. And also what was really interesting is women of colour were also elected in greater numbers, now making up 17% of women MPs. And that's actually in line with the general UK population. So there are some positives in the report, so we are heading in the right direction. But I think what it concludes on is it's time for all sectors to actively work towards enabling women to reach higher positions of power. So this is just a slide on the income tax rates in the UK, and it's broken up by Scotland.
It's pretty similar to the Australian structure. Obviously, the dollars are a bit different, but
yeah, I was thinking that actually.
The progressive structure is reasonably similar.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that then leads on to the fact that, yes, there was a positive increase in the high rate threshold, and it was increased to 50,000 in April 2019. However, that actually has a detrimental impact on gender equality because it benefited more men than women. And I know, Fran, you'll talk more about that, and you've done a lot of research around this. And Treasury actually admitted in the past 68% of men had benefited from this. And the reason behind that is because there's more women doing typically lower paid jobs, and also because of the gender pay gap. So I think the conclusion around that is we really need to tackle the gender pay gap. So then that then leads me on to the median gross hourly gender pay gap. So you can see there that it's broken down by full-time and part-time employees, but the gap becomes a lot worse when you move from age 30 onwards, which is really interesting. So that could be linked to the fact that typically in the UK that's when women will start to have children. Also, it's quite high, ages 40 to 49, 50, so that could also then be linked. I talk a little bit about menopause at work and how that's not really talked about that much in society, so you could have some link there and the impacts that can have on women, on some women when they go through it. And also what's interesting in these stats is clearly, as expected, there's more women doing part-time work compared to men. And that's from the Office of National Statistics. So, moving on to some actions that can be taken to tackle the gender pay gap. And actions that have been proved to show effect are one thing which I'm quite keen on, and actually we've been endorsing quite a lot internally as well, is having multiple women in shortlist for recruitment and promotions. And the research shows that you need to have more than one woman on the shortlist, but I think I would go further than that. My take is you need at least 50% of women on shortlist for recruitment. So not only do companies have a role to play in this, but I think recruitment consultants also have a role to play in this. And I think companies should hold any consultant in recruitment firms accountable if they don't really give them sufficient diverse shortlists of candidates. It also talks about having structured interviews for recruitment, because that takes away unfair bias that can take place during interviews. What's also interesting is there should be encouragement for women to negotiate more on salaries as well. Current research shows that men are more likely to negotiate salaries than women. So there's some education to be done around that. Then there's also recommendation that organisations appoint diversity managers and or diversity task force. And also something interesting that's also come out recently in research is the onus shouldn't just lie on HR departments, but it should be equal throughout the business, basically, and getting more senior leaders involved. Then actions that the Government Equalities Office found needed more research, but they did say had promising impacts, were improving flexibility in the workforce for both men and women. And also what's useful there is to get role models, senior role models in men, basically demonstrating that they are working flexibly. That has a positive impact. Encouraging uptake of shared parental leave, which I'll talk a bit more about that in my next couple of slides. And then recruiting more returners, so individuals who have taken gaps, whether it's because of caring for children, because they've had to care for elderly relatives, etc., but recruiting more of those individuals so we get people back into the workforce. Then also there's positive impact of offering women mentoring and sponsorship. And one point I just wanted to draw on mentoring, I think there's a common misconception that women can only benefit by having female mentors. And actually, my view of that differs. I think you can have positive experience of having both male and female mentors. And actually, I've had both. And when I had a male mentor in the past, I found it really benefited me, because it was really great to have a sounding board, but also it was great to have someone who could act as a male ally. And basically, by having more male mentors for women, they understand the issues that women are facing. They then go out to the wider business and act as male allies for other women. So I think there's some positives around that too. Then there's positives around having sponsorship as well. So that's differs to mentoring in that a sponsor basically supports advancement and basically visibility, so they help the person get into a more senior role and help promote them, basically. It also talks about setting internal goals, and when organisations are setting internal goals, they should make those timely as well. So there's a time period where organisations have to be accountable, where the senior leadership team needs to be accountable. So moving on, a bit more about shared parental leave. Even though this has been around for a while, for a good number of years in the UK, what's interesting is recent research shows it's only been, uptake has only been 2%, which is really low. So what needs to happen is fathers need to be informed about their legal right to take up this as well. I think what also needs to happen is senior leaders within organisations need to act as examples and really role model. And I think businesses need to make more communication about senior leaders who have done this, male leaders who have done this, and what they've gained from it as well. And the research shows that gender pay gap widens dramatically after women have children. So I think it's a great benefit we have in the UK, but what really needs to happen is there needs to be wider communication around this and more encouragement towards men. So moving on, homing in a bit more about the improving flexibility in the workplace. So the study suggested that all jobs should be advertised with flexible options. That could be part-time, it could be remote working, compressed hours as well. And then again, it talks about senior leaders role modelling again and encouraging men to work flexibly. So it's not just seen as a female benefit. So that's quite interesting. I think the point about remote working is quite interesting as well, because sometimes there can be limitations on what organisations can do, whether or not they can offer a role part-time. But I think the remote working really helps individuals, and actually research shows it actually makes people more productive as well, because they cut out commute times as well, so it's quite interesting there. Then this is a graph on trend in the UK labour workforce. So as you can see, goes back to 1970s and up to 2019. So whilst you can see that the gap has definitely converged in terms of percentage of women in the workforce compared to men. In 2019, you've got 71% of women in the workforce versus 80% men. So definitely very positive direction, but it's still not enough. So and women, of course, still need to be paid equally. So it doesn't take into account whether or not women are paid equally or not. But it's good to see that positive movement.
Something interesting about that chart, you've got the same, more or less the same gap. It's the same period as Australia,
really
more or less. It's
yeah.
basically the same gap, but you have significantly more workforce participation in the UK than
Yeah,
we have
I
in
saw
Australia.
that. That's
I'm not
interesting.
quite sure what the explanation for that is, because your population is ageing faster than ours, so
Yes,
it's not an age
completely.
distribution. That's not the answer. Anyway,
Yeah, it'd be
it's like a
interesting.
full 10% higher.
It is,
There's also that significant drop in the male participation rate
Yes.
in the beginning of the chart, which
True,
seems
that's
to be
a good point.
deindustrialization.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
See.
I think that's probably right.
Actually, that's really interesting.
So
Yeah.
there are
So it's only because these stats are only participation,
yeah.
it would be the same in ours. So it could be any number of hours. So this doesn't tell you about full and part-time. This aggregate statistic, it just tells you whether there's a link to the labour market, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite
Anyway.
interesting. Brilliant. So I'll speed up. No, it's okay.
No,
It's a really
that's
good point, observation actually. I'll speed up slightly because I'm conscious of time, and Fran, you need to talk. So this is just a slide that basically summarises unpaid work by gender. And as expected, typically women do more unpaid work, and approximately the chart shows that women do double the amount of unpaid work as men, basically. So we still have some way to go there. Then I'm not going to go too much into details on this, on the pensions pay gap, but clearly there's an issue around that as well. So pensions pay gap is exaggerated by the gender pay gap. But there's other factors that come into this, which I've already mentioned, typically that women do more low paid work. Then, of course, there's gaps in women's careers as well. So they take out quite big amounts of time from the workplace. And typically, one stat I just wanted to draw your attention on is men's average pension contributions to a defined pension contribution scheme in the UK represent 186% of women's contributions. That's interesting. And I think what needs to also be taken into account here is actually women live longer as well. So it's quite worrying that we have this statistic. So clearly something needs to be done around this issue. Then just wanted to talk a little bit about domestic violence. 1 in 3 women in Europe are victims of physical and sexual violence in their lifetime, which is clearly a stark statistic. A lot of victims are employed, basically approximately 50%. So there's research being shown that actually employers can support these women more. And obviously it's an issue that people don't really generally talk about. But what's interesting is the government has actually released a toolkit for employers to help spot signs of when there might be signs of women going through domestic violence, and what can they do to support them. So it talks about like reduction in productivity, also if a female employee is absent for, and there's not, there's not sufficient reasoning behind why she's absent, etc. But I won't go too much into that. So that just talks about that a bit more. So there's encouragement there for what can employers do to help these victims, and also grant them paid leave so that we don't lose these women within the workforce. And then final slide is what changes can be made. So this is a bit of a controversial one. My first point is, should we think about applying a tax on companies with large gender pay gaps? And I think we should take that further to BAME pay gaps, so when the ethnicity pay gap comes in. And also we should think about incorporating LGBTQ plus pay gap, but it's a bit of a controversial one, so maybe at the end the audience can say how they feel about that one, but it might help companies to become more accountable. Yeah. We should clearly need a reform of childcare.
And a diverted profits tax of
yeah.
gender pay gap.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that summary, actually, it's good. Perhaps we could learn something from the Nordics model. Clearly, they're doing really well in the gender equality space, and we maybe need to look at our work-life balance. We need to perhaps think about creating tax incentive for carers in the UK. There needs to be some education around menopause, because what's interesting is for some women it can have a really detrimental impact on them. They can completely lose confidence. They can go through anxiety, panic attacks, and years of not being able to sleep. So the reason I know quite a lot about this is we actually had Gender Equality Week at L'Oreal, which I'm on the committee for, towards the end of last year. And there was actually a session on menopause, and I came out thinking, oh my God, I had no idea about all of this. So if I can't understand it as a woman, and it's clearly show there's some education to do there. And then final 2 points are perhaps we could look at extending gender pay gap to companies with more than 100 employees. And maybe we should look at a higher personal allowance for working women, but then we also need to look at what do we do for non-working women. And interestingly enough, they have something similar to that in India. I'm now going to end and hand over to Fran, so you have enough time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your last point is essentially the equivalent to a lower tax rate.
Yes.
Right? So if you give a larger allowance, you essentially generate a lower tax rate. And there is economic research that suggests that would be an efficient policy from an economic policy perspective, and an equitable policy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we need to leave some time for discussion, so I'll try not to take too long, and therefore I won't actually talk about the outline. So the presentation about Australia showed that it has an individually based income tax, but totally means-tested benefits, which is actually quite a rare example of a country with all its benefits means-tested. That means they're based on the benefit unit, or the household, the couple, basically. But it is actually partially individualised, which we might talk about in the discussion, but just slightly. More than ours, anyway. Whereas in the UK, we have individual income tax, but that's recently been compromised in ways that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But our social security system is a mix of non-means-tested, so individually based, and means-tested benefits. And in fact, the non-means-tested benefits have become increasingly individualised, whereas the whole system is shifting towards more means testing, particularly with the recent policy focus on universal credit, which I've done quite a lot of work on. In both countries, we have active feminists who are doing gender analysis, gender impact assessment, and in the UK, that's particularly done by the Women's Budget Group, which I'm an active member of, and on the Policy Advisory Group, as Ian said. So, in terms of gender analysis, Miranda talked about principles for gender impact assessment. This is actually quite similar, but I've taken here the principles for gender analysis of welfare reform, which I developed with Janet Veitch in 2010 when we were doing something on universal credit for Oxfam quite early on. So what we said was we should look at the amount of resources transferred from men to women or vice versa, and how many women or men are affected, but that is not the end of it. Also, you need to look at the makeup and labelling of any transfer of resources. What is it called? How is it known? And the effect of any such transfers and the way in which they're labelled and so on gender roles and relationships, not just the amount of money. You need to consider the impact on the degree of autonomy which is enjoyed by women and men, and you need to consider the impact on inequalities both within and outside the household at the point of any change and over the life course. I have to say, I think that is very seldom done in the usual run of things in terms of policies. So looking at taxation and gender in the UK, first of all, this is why is taxation important for gender issues? This is not from me, this is from Susan Himmelweit, who's also a member of the Women's Budget Group. So what she says is tax is an important part of government policy, and government has duties in relation to gender inequalities, and therefore the two have to be considered together. The incidence of taxation can affect the relative positions of women and men, as we've seen from Miranda's and Tasneem's presentations. Services and benefits funded by taxation are particularly important for women, so they're particularly more reliant on public services and on benefits than men are. And the incidence of tax and the benefits and services it funds can also affect behaviour. So the kinds of incentives and the interactions that Miranda was talking about. And so therefore it can potentially also affect gender inequalities in the future and not just at the moment. And she also argues that we should see taxation as a contribution and not a burden, and cuts, when they come, i.e. tax cuts, are not gender neutral because of the existing gender inequalities. So here, my focus is going to be income tax, which means that we're leaving out of account capital gains tax, inheritance tax, VAT, and all that. Now, that's really important because you might say that there are gender inequalities there as well. I'm going to look at income tax in particular. I'm going to look at independent taxation, transferable tax allowance, high income child benefit charge, and then I'm going to finish up with some more general issues. So independent taxation 30 years on. This happened in 1990, of course. Married women's income was treated as her own for the first time. She paid less tax on her own income than if she was taxed together with her husband, as she was before. There was a greater incentive to have her own income. Privacy and autonomy in tax affairs. They didn't write to the husband about her tax issues, which they did before. But to avoid losses, the married couple's allowance was actually retained, but it was actually abolished with all-party support a decade later. The arguments in terms of the independent tax debate focused on what we called, when I was at Child Poverty Action Group, social priorities in taxation. In other words, we argued that marriage and civil partnership creates no need in and of itself, so why should it be tax privileged? And the language of taxing families and family-friendly tax, which particularly is put forward these days, this is up to date, by Christian Action, Research and Education, CARE, and Tax and the Family, which have overlapping memberships, I should say, often refers in practice not to anything about families really, but to single earner couples, either married or civil partners, with or without children, with non-earners, who are largely women.
This is your breadwinner homemaker.
Exactly.
What I was talking about
exactly.
As the breadwinner homemaker.
So it's often about increasing support for the traditional family in practice. It looks just at the balance between one earner and two earner families. It doesn't look at, for example, what happens to women and men over the life course. So the transferable tax allowance has been introduced recently in the UK, 2015, and it's a partial transfer of 1/10 of the personal tax allowance for couples with neither partner paying higher rate tax and one partner not using all or any of their personal tax allowance. The Prime Minister at the time said this is not about money, but recognising marriage. The reason he said that was because it's very little money. Many married couples don't qualify, in fact, and many civil partners do, so it wasn't necessarily about recognising marriage at the time. And it is only a small step, yes, but it's in the wrong direction. 85% of the main earners who were getting transferable tax allowance at the time of the introduction were men. It was a trade-off, basically, for free school meals universally for all 5 to 7-year-olds in the coalition government. So the Liberal Democrats said, you can have your transferable tax allowance if we have, universal free school meals. Great. You would have thought that they would all agree with universal free school meals, but no, they had to have the transferable tax allowance. Actually, there's low take-up amongst those who are eligible for it, and that's caused concern amongst the people who promote it. The Prime Minister said if your partner doesn't use all the allowance, you can have some of it. So that was a very interesting way of putting it. In other words, what it does is reward the higher earner in a couple for having a partner with no earnings or low earnings, because they get part of their personal tax allowance, basically. So what it does is to enhance the higher earner's income and, of course, the difference, therefore, between the partners' incomes. There's already, of course, in the same way that Miranda talked about, a clawback of gains from paid work for many second earners because of means-tested universal credit. I mean, I could go on about that for hours, but it's mostly a tax seminar, so I'm not going to. But the transferable tax allowance risks worsening those incentives further for second earners, largely women, in principle. Now, at the moment, it's so small that I have to say I don't think it does very much compared with means-tested benefits, for example. But if it was extended further, it might do. And I believe that individuals today have aspirations that are so much higher than wanting to be part of somebody else's taxable capacity, which is basically what happens with the transferable tax allowance.
So that would be capability.
Yeah. So the other thing that has happened recently to compromise independent taxation is the high-income child benefit tax charge. This is often wrongly described as means testing child benefit. It's not a means test on child benefit at all. Child benefit, of course, is the main way that the fiscal system recognises family needs. And unlike Australia's system, this is not means tested. And until recently, it was universal without the tax charge. So it's preferable to the previous system, which included child tax allowances and family allowances as well. Family allowances were like child benefit. But there were also child tax allowances, and they were amalgamated in the late 70s into child benefit, and that is better. Partly because it's paid to the mother or the main carer, partly because it isn't paid to the main earner, as child tax allowances were, and partly because it's the same amount for everybody rather than increasing in terms of your marginal tax rate at the top, as child tax allowances did. But from 2013, the higher income child benefit charge was introduced, and actually HMRC's website calls it correctly the higher income child benefit tax charge, because what it is additional tax on people with children. That's basically what it is. So it's for households with somebody getting child benefit and somebody on an adjusted net income of 50,000 to 60,000 a year. These could be the same person, but they could be different people, okay? And it means that there is a tax charge for people on those incomes, and effectively for people above that income as well, because they just lose their child benefit completely above £60,000 a year. Adjusted income has got a technical definition, but that doesn't matter much. This means a higher tax rate for some lone parents and some partners in couples with children over that income range, and, as I said, not for those without children. Or you give up your child benefit. If you give up your child benefit, you don't get this high effective marginal tax rate over a certain band of income. The former recipient of child benefit loses an independent income, of course, if that's the case, or part of their independent income. They potentially lose their pension rights if they don't make sure that they claim child benefit and then give it up. And if they don't do that, then their children's national insurance numbers are not given automatically at age 16, as they would be if they received child benefit. We think there's some non-compliance with this, possibly, and as with the transferable tax allowance, it complicates the UK tax system. There are beginning to be far more press articles about this, so the issue is actually beginning to be raised much more now. And of course, it creates these stupid high marginal tax rates between £50,000 and £60,000, which, if you have 3 or 4 children, are just unbelievably high. They're like the kind of high marginal rates that Miranda was talking about, which are caused by means-tested benefit withdrawal. And it's very similar, which is why some people confuse it. It compromises independent taxation because you each know the other's income and so on, with no guarantee of support to from one person to the children to replace the child benefit that is being taken away or given up. And it imposes additional tax only on better off people who have children, which seems to me completely bonkers, to be honest. It perpetuates a double standard between benefits and tax allowances, because basically this was seen as the better off's contribution to austerity, but actually it only affected people who got benefit rather than people who got tax allowances. And it could be argued to compromise the human rights of children if child benefit is given up. Okay, that's why I don't think they're very good things, those two. So just lastly, tax and benefit assessment units. I want to cut this down because we will run out of time. It's partly that I think this is often very confused because some people argue, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies has argued in the past, that income tax is assessed on individuals but benefits on the family unit, and this is contradictory. That is just wrong, right? The joint assessment is only for means-tested benefits and tax credits. It's not for other benefits. Those are individual. And the earnings rule, if there is an earnings rule, is an individual one. So other benefits are individual, and they're increasingly so, as I said earlier, because they have abolished dependence increases, and they're also abolishing derived benefit rights for married people. So they're becoming increasingly individualised, in fact. I'm not going to talk about the couple penalty. But the problem about means-tested benefits is partly an independence penalty. So the PhD in the form of an article here, which I examined, is about the fact that she interviewed lone parents and she asked them about their partnership decisions, and basically quite a few of them said they didn't want to lose the independent income that they got as a lone parent by moving in with somebody who had their own income, and therefore the lone parent would no longer get any income. And that's particularly the case, of course, as a threat with the single payment arrangement for universal credit, because you only get one payment per couple. And if it goes to the other partner, then it may be quite likely you have nothing left at all, apart from, probably, child benefit and council tax benefit.
So you get that joint unit kind of reinstated.
Very, very much so, but payment as well, not just the assessment. So just in terms of priorities and principles to finish off, I think you should look at tax and benefit services together without assuming that the current pattern is necessarily right. The case for independent tax is, if anything, stronger today. And this is because of some work by Laurie and Khan, which talked about how even investments and savings are more individualised these days. There's also, of course, a multiplicity of family forms, including people living apart together. And within households, individuals may have obligations outside the household to previous families, for example. So not everything is joint inside. And if we're worried about somebody who isn't earning within the household, we need to find out why that's the case. Whether the tax and benefit system should do anything about that or not. And if so, how best to do so. And I would argue that if we do that, the support for caring is better directed to the carer themselves rather than the partner's tax. That children should basically be the priority for support through the fiscal system because they're an additional cost. This is like horizontal redistribution, really. Child benefit is incredibly simple, flexible, neutral, follows the child, should be seen as equivalent to a tax credit, and if better off people should pay more tax, it shouldn't be just those with children who do. And then don't extend the transferable tax allowance, surprise, surprise. Don't continue to increase the personal tax allowance, in my view. Instead, unfreeze child benefit, restore its universality and increase it in real terms. Give childcare support via the supply side, not the demand side, which would get rid of a lot of the problems with tax exemption or means-tested benefits being withdrawn at higher income levels. Give more generous payment for parental leave with the right to return, and a period reserved for fathers. I don't think shared parental leave will cut it, I'm afraid. I think you have to have a use or lose, as you said, in terms of the Nordic system. And improving carers' allowance, as they have done already in Scotland, for those caring for elderly disabled people as well. Thank you very much. Sorry to rush.
wide range of issues. We do still have some time for questions and comments, which I would like to encourage. We have either these desk mics, which work as long as you keep holding the button, or there is a roving mic. So we can see who we have questions from.
I think we had a question.
Eduardo had his hand up.
Fran, I'm Sarah. Hi. You mentioned that you didn't think shared parental leave would cut it. What's your views on mandatory shared parental leave as opposed to this optionality system that we currently have? And what sorts of economic benefits or impacts do you think it would have?
I don't think you could introduce mandatory shared parental leave. But what I'm talking about is use it or lose it leave, which is very common in other continental European countries, which means that if the father doesn't take their allocated period of leave, then the couple loses it. And that appears to work quite well. I mean, basically, you need to do that, and you need to pay men well in order for men to take parental leave. And at the moment, we do neither of those things in the UK, and so it's not working.
So I might just give a comment. I didn't talk about parental leave at all. In Australia, we have much less well-developed parental leave. There is now a paid government system. But actually, again, we could have had another news article on the slide. It's funny how these things are increasingly in the media. Obviously, they're real issues. So it is possible to transfer paid parental leave that's been awarded to, at first instance, the primary carer, the mother. So she could transfer her paid parental leave to a father under our system in Australia. But because it's a transfer, it's assessed at her wage rate, which, as we saw, is lower generally. And so the outcry is that, well, he can't get parental leave tested on his income. This is about the level. Oh. So there's so that's optional. So the family doesn't have an incentive to do that because they're going to lose his salary, which is higher, and the parental leave doesn't cover it. So there's all sorts of problems with systems that do that. But you do need that combined with then childcare support, I think. You need both policies. Did you have a... Yeah. He's got his hand up.
As you know, studies were invented in the late 60s, the concept of tax expenditure.
Yeah.
According to which, this concept refers to when the tax system is used as a way of allocating subsidies in an implicit way. And he suggested that the US Congress should apply this concept in order to know each time it passes a tax reform, what sort of subsidies the tax system is allocating in order to make the political process more transparent. So I wonder to what extent a similar concept could be applied to the topic we're talking today, the problem of gender equality. So what about if in the UK, Australia, and similar countries, the local parliament or Congress has the duty to make an ex-ante political control on the net impact of both the taxing power and spending power before passing the legislation. So to make this very short, what about applying this fantastic concept of tax expenditure from, implicit subsidies to the area of gender equality? Does it make any sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Well, essentially, with my high effective marginal tax rates, what we've got is implicit taxes as opposed to implicit subsidies. So it's like a negative tax expenditure. And then if you had a subsidy delivery, like a personal allowance or a transfer payment or free childcare, then that would be either a direct subsidy, like actually a payment or a grant, or it's delivered through the tax system. So it really is a tax expenditure already under current definitions. But some form of reporting of those implicit taxes or implicit subsidies would be a part of kind of good gender analysis, I think. That would be one way to look at the fiscal cost of that and the effect of that on households.
I think the one problem with that is that you need to agree a baseline.
Yeah, you need a benchmark.
So the idea of the tax expenditures really requires that you know what the benchmark tax system is.
That's true.
To know what the expenditures are against it. And I think one of the challenges particularly in the the gender field, is that that's where the disagreement is. And this whole discussion, it seems to me, is about raising the level of what we think the requirements are. So, I mean, you can apply that tax expenditure analysis to it, but in many ways it seems the discussion today is saying it's getting the recognition of what those requirements should be. That's the first step. And the tax expenditure would then make it transparent once you get the agreement. But it seems to me these arguments are really saying we need to change our thinking about what the baseline of the tax system should be.
No, I was just going to turn that off.
Oh.
No reason why we should have that last slide on
But
that.
it's certainly a value.
That's interesting.
Any other questions or comments?
Ian?
Oh, sorry. Keep looking around.
Yeah, fantastic set of presentations from all of you. Is this working? Yeah, good.
It is
Yeah.
you've got it sort of backhand.
Oh,
That's all right.
yeah. Yeah, so I was really interested in the slides that you had about high income splitting
Yes, it's very
evidence from tax data. I was wondering whether in Australia you can link tax records by household. Can you link individual records? We can't do that in the UK currently. So that was going to be one question, because you're observing the difference between men and women, and I guess probably fairly assuming that many of the women have high earning partners and that there's some income shifting going on, but can you observe that directly by linking the records? And then I guess the follow-up to that is, it'd be great if we could do that, but even if we could, that would only really tell us about the kind of legal ownership of these assets, partly for tax purposes. And I guess to Fran's point, and obviously Fran knows Kate's work about how people think about their control of assets within the household, might actually bear very little relation to what they put for the purpose of the tax form. So just, interested in more about those kinds of issues.
Yeah, why don't I respond first and then
Yeah, go
Fran.
ahead.
So on that last point, I think that's exactly right. I mean, what we see in the tax planning and the income splitting, especially when we use discretionary trusts, which we do much more actively than you do in the UK, because you have quite a sensible rule for how to tax trusts, whereas we permit income splitting and discretionary allocation to low-income household members in our system, is that there's no relation. It doesn't mean that the woman gets or controls the income. She might, but it's in the tax return or in the legal documentation only. In terms of the data itself, no, we can't link individuals. It's not because there's a rule against it, it's because the data is not good. So going forward, we will be able to, because you are required to state if you have a spouse or not on the tax return. And so it's a mandatory question, but in their wisdom, the Tax Office and the Treasury for about a decade in the 90s made that an optional question. So you could tick or not whether you had a spouse, because of course it didn't matter for your own tax. So if it's completely unreliable, of course, we can't rely on that data. We can actually potentially link those things. There's a little bit of indirect evidence that I'll just briefly mention. So we tried, in this paper we wrote, we looked indirectly at a few other indicators that support our analysis. One is that we find that for those women and men in the top 1%, the share of income from wages of the women who are in, that higher proportion of women in that top 1%, that they only earn a relatively small share of their income comes from wages, because actually, so that they're not up there because they're themselves earning wages. In fact, they're earning an over proportion of what's called investment income, which includes partnership and trust allocation. So we can see that in the tax return data.
I wonder, is that accumulated family wealth you're thinking there? Or
Well,
it's
it's from the spouse. It's basically from the spouse. So it's set up through a trust or an assignment sort of structure. So implicitly we can see that. And the other odd thing in the statistics, which is not particularly reliable, but which is very interesting, is that we can see occupation data in the tax return statistics in Australia. So you're supposed to, at some point in your tax return, you state, are you a lawyer, a teacher, an administrative assistant, and so on. And what we find is that there is a substantial proportion of women in the top 1% of income who declare low-earning occupations as their work. So supposedly they're earning these very low wages in sort of administrative assistant type jobs, but they're getting an awful lot of income. And so that income is coming from a tax planning structure. Sorry.
No, just to add to that, just to say, I mean, there's one issue which is who is asked in household surveys about household income, and does the person who is asked know about the income of the household, and are both people asked? And even if both people are asked, do they give the same answer? So this is just from qualitative research, which I did with low-income couples with Sirin Sum some years ago. But we would go to a house and we would do separate interviews with the man and the woman, and we wouldn't bring them together at all, and we would keep it confidential. And we'd go to a house and say, and do you get child benefit? And the man would say no, and the woman would say, we get child benefit. And the man would say, you'd say to the man, well, does your teenager get educational maintenance allowance, which actually existed at the time? And he'd say, no, I don't think so. And the mother would say, yeah, she gets educational maintenance. So, the level of knowledge is a slightly separate point, but I quite liked the stories that we came across. But the other thing is the difference between legal ownership and how people feel about it, and that was some work done by Karen Rowlingson and other people, in particular about capital assets and savings and investments, actually, rather than about forms of income. But it showed very clearly that that what was legally defined as either joint or individual was not necessarily seen in that way by either both members of the couple or one of them.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Please.
A couple. There's one.
Well, just recently, Franz, this is probably a question for you, or maybe a little bit of a comment. Oh, sorry, Sarah Blakelock. I happen to be Australian, so I understand the Australian system, but I happen to be over here as well. So, but I asked this question because I think it's quite interesting having a look at the use of family trust for income splitting in Australia. And I'm interested in particular about the use of incorporation in this country for income splitting. And obviously the level of incorporation over the last 10 years in this country has increased quite dramatically. I'm just wondering how much research has been done around income splitting and the impact on family unit taxation as a result, and whether that's something we really just haven't really, I guess, looked at or had cause to look at. And I guess a lot of the changes, I think, just from a child tax benefit to a child and some of the transfer system benefits here over the last year are quite interesting in terms of how that's all played through. Or maybe it's all just a bit too new and we haven't had a chance to look at it.
If you're asking me about what's happening in this country, I have no idea about the incorporation that you're talking about. I wonder whether Andy might.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that the short answer is no real work has been done on that yet using tax records. I think there is some in the offing, hopefully, fingers crossed. On incorporation more generally, the IFS has done a bit of work linking tax records of individuals to companies, looking at retained profits. They actually haven't really explored that, as far as I'm aware, from a gender perspective. And I think that the way they do that linking wouldn't easily enable them to look at sort of spousal units or sort of family units being used through incorporations, but clearly kind of anecdotally and just understanding the tax planning landscape, I suspect there is a lot of that going on. I don't know how well it substitutes for the trusts approach in Australia.
We would have corporations used as well. It's just that this particular Everett assignment is a sort of a combination of a trust and partnership split arrangement. And families do use discretionary trusts. High-income families use discretionary trusts a lot in Australia.
There has been some effort by HMRC to try and crack down on some of these systems, the famous Arctic Systems case and so forth. So, but how effective it is another question. And the problem is that it's relatively easy to transfer assets between spouses, but they make it more difficult to transfer wage income, earned income from whether from wages or businesses, and that creates a tension in the system, which relates to some of these issues that Miranda was talking about at the top. So it's quite a complex situation, which is ripe for research, even at a legal level, quite apart from looking at the returns and figuring out what's actually happening. It may not come out.
Complexity is a feature of this whole issue, both at the bottom end, the interaction of welfare payments and tax rates, and at the top end, the tax planning. At both ends, it's a highly complex situation. Just one more.
We had one more question.
I just have one quick question. A lot of the data looks like it's to do with heterosexual couples and marriages. Is there anything on same-sex, and are the trends the same at all, if there is anything?
In terms of the tax data stuff, no, in Australia there hasn't been, but there is empirical evidence about income sharing and labour supply. There's studies from the US in particular, I guess, about same-sex couples. It shouldn't surprise you to know that they are more equal than heterosexual couples, especially female same-sex couples tend to be sharing both working and also sharing care in households where they're raising children. Actually, ironically, gay male couples sometimes fall into the breadwinner homemaker structure. Might be partly driven by the higher wages. So if one is able to get very high wage, they can support. Might also be driven by that choice to parent children is not an easy choice, and there's a lot of social and cultural stuff happening there as well. So there is a bit of evidence, but more about labour supply. I don't know if you know anything.
No, I don't. And I think the answer is basically, I would have basically said very much the same. I mean, some of these issues that I was talking about in terms of tax units would apply to civil partnerships, and they would also apply to same-sex marriage now, presumably, now that the same-sex marriage as well. They would be treated, the same opportunities or problematic complexities would be similar if they've got that kind of formal union as opposed to cohabitation. But the same is also true, I think, of what Miranda said in terms of there has been some research about both income sharing and sharing of paid and unpaid work with same-sex couples, and I would endorse what she said in terms of the what work there has been in the UK as well. Although there has been some, I mean, I did something on income sharing within the household for the Journal of Marriage and Family, so it's kind of summarised there, but a review article, I mean. But some of that did show that it was quite hard if you have a higher income and a lower income person not to get into a pattern whereby if the income was shared, the lower income person didn't feel they were contributing. And so it's quite hard. It's quite hard not to fall into those similar patterns that we know of old, I think.
Actually, I know we are over time. You guys are being very courteous.
Yes.
But this is quite a funny story. So when same-sex recognition was extended in Australia, so both de facto spouse and marriage more recently, actually the government saved money. So what had, it's obviously a very small proportion of the population, but especially female couples raising children, having children, because they were not seen, the relationship was not visible previously to the law, mothers were getting parents' pension, sole parents' pension and so on in those same-sex couple relationships. They were living with their partner. They weren't deterred from living with a partner because they were not visible to the law. So when that same-sex relationship was recognised, those women lost benefits. Right, and the fiscal estimates, like the tax expenditure estimate, was about 60 million Australian dollars a year was saved as a result of
By
not paying
recognising.
out benefits, as a result of the legal formal recognition of those relationships. So
Whoa.
I did tell gay and lesbian advocates at the time that this would be a consequence of
Yeah.
equality. The downsides of formal equality are that actually, then you faced all the constraints that, everybody else in the population
Yeah.
was facing. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Ian.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's better not to be visible to the law, right?
Yeah, true.
Thank you so much to all our three panelists, Miranda, Fran and Tasneem.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for
Thank you
coming.
all.
This is part of our series of taxation seminars. The next one is next Monday, when Miranda Stewart will be back.